this video, what I want to do is I want to talk about Thomas Aquinas on the notion of war, and specifically the notion of just warfare. We'll talk about his notions of jus ad bellum and jus in bello, which mean justice going going into war and then justice in war, respectively. And so we'll talk about this in contradistinction to what I already said last time about Motze. So that's the plan today. Let's go ahead and get into it. Okay. So before we even get into the matter of what Thomas Aquinas has to say about warfare, I want to explain just a little bit about Thomas Aquinas in the context of this work. So this book is the Summa Theologica, and sometimes the Summa Theologiae, depending on the edition that you're looking at. And in a certain sense, it's incomplete. And let me say, this book is absolutely enormous. It literally, the title means the sum of all theology. Now, that doesn't just mean theology directly about God, but also a lot of stuff indirectly about God. And so this was written in the 13th century. Thomas here lived 1225 to 1274. He almost made 50, but not quite. And at the time, Thomas was not a particularly controversial figure and hasn't been really since, but he wasn't a particularly popular figure at the time in which he was living. Nevertheless, Thomas is crucial. He's not the originator, but he is crucial for the appropriation of Aristotelian thought really in the Christian world. And Aristotelian thought not limited simply to the logical writings and tradition of Aristotle, but a lot also the metaphysics and the physics and the ethics. And a lot of that comes by his attribution to Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and some other Islamic thinkers as well, where these people said, these Islamic thinkers who said these particular things about Aristotle, they have some points. He wrote a whole book on why they're kind of wrong, why the Islamic view of God is mistaken. That book is Summa contra Gentiles, or as I've heard some people pronounce it, Summa contra Gentiles. Really, the sum of arguments, or the summary of arguments against the non-believer is what those books would mean. But he has a great admiration for the Islamic traditions, interpretations of Aristotle. And again, it's not solely because of Thomas, but he ends up kind of being the conduit by which, or through which, Aristotle is reintroduced to the Western world in many respects. Again, it's not reducible to him, but he plays a huge part. And it doesn't happen immediately. It happens over the course of a couple of centuries. Other people are wrestling with Aristotelian thinking as well. It takes off in the Renaissance and the rediscovery of Greek and Latin classical literature. And then also, Thomas's reckoning is really comes up in the Protestant Reformations as well, such that the Protestants, in many ways, are very anti-Aristotelian. Luther says this directly before Luther's even really a Protestant. By that I mean, Luther, does the 95 Theses, October 31st, 1517. In 1516, he wrote a disputation on scholastic theology while he was still a professor of Bible, I believe, at Wittenberg, University of Wittenberg, where he says, he says many things such as, it'd be better, in certain respects, it'd be better, I can't remember if it's about Porphyry or Aristotle directly, but it'd be better if some of these Greek thinkers had never been born, for all the corruption that they've caused in Christian thinking. And in many respects, his arguments there is that Christian thinking needs to be divorced from these philosophical aspects. That's Luther. Now, some of the other Protestant reformers, like Calvin comes to mind, John Calvin. Of course, he doesn't like Aristotelian metaphysics, but there are some Aristotelian ways of explaining things that he does like. So he adopts a lot of the terminology, but not really the metaphysics. Whereas in a lot of Catholic thinking, especially after the Council of Trent in 1576, where the anti or the counter-Reformation, or the depending on what you want to call it, basically says, no, here's what it means to be a Catholic. And there's a lot of appeals to Thomas Aquinas there. And there have been since, really until the 20th century, such that Thomas Aquinas is considered a doctor of the church. He's considered a major thinker. He's one of those thinkers where, regardless of one's position, the prolific writer, profound thinker, period. No matter what one's philosophical persuasion is, that is, I think, incontrovertible, is the magnitude of what kind of a thinker Thomas Aquinas is. All right. So, but also, he wrote in the Middle Ages, and even though we've done some stuff we've looked at many texts from Chinese and Greek traditions, Latin traditions in the ancient world, the Middle Ages, this is really the latest text we've done in terms of time and chronology. This is the closest to the present. But there's a certain sense in which the Middle Ages gets kind of a bad rap. And let me say this, a lot of that comes from a lot of stuff in the Enlightenment and the French Revolution where, Immanuel Kant in the, I think I want to say late 18th century, all right, that's when he lived most of his life. But he says, he has a piece called, I believe, Was heißt Aufklärung? Okay, what is enlightenment? He's writing about the Enlightenment during the Enlightenment. He says, what enlightenment is it is the end to mankind's self-imposed childhood. Okay, usually translates that as minority. All right, what is enlightenment? An essay called "What is Enlightenment?" An answer to the question, "What is enlightenment?" That's the name of that piece. And in there, he says it's the end of basically our probationary period as humans. All right, now we're finally growing up and we're casting off the old shackles, including this Middle Age stuff. But you'll notice often, the names that we used to refer to this period in really Western European history, other parts of the world are doing something different. Why? What makes it the Middle Ages? Oh, because it's between something and something else. And it's almost always referred to in these strange ways, referring to other things that don't quite make much sense, like the Middle Ages. Well, if you're going to have a Middle Ages, it has to be between something. Well, between what? Oh, between the great ancient world and then the great modern world. And the Middle Ages is sort of this meh stuff that happened in the middle. And certainly, while there's different trends going on, and there's a reduction of urbanization that you saw in the Roman Empire in Western Europe, to say that it was like a complete loss or absolute failure is a complete historical mischaracterization. So there's a lot of thoughtful philosophical work going on, developments in notions of politics, developments in pre-scientific notions. I mean, there wouldn't have been a scientific revolution if the so-called, and there wouldn't have been that so-called enlightenment, although I think there's also enlightenments, all right? There wouldn't have been renaissances, reformations, enlightenments, all these different movements that did come out of Western Europe. None of those things would have happened had the Middle Ages not played out things the way that they did. Including the very existence of the works of Thomas Aquinas, whether people came later to endorse him, like, say, someone like Francisco Suarez, thinker, or someone who came to kind of supplant him, someone like René Descartes, who still considered himself a good Catholic. I'm not sure the church would agree with that, but that was in his own mind. Well, part of the reason why the Middle Ages, and again, sometimes the Dark Ages, I can't remember if that was Diderot or Voltaire who came up with that. That was the pejorative term. What's worse than Middle Ages? Dark Ages. Like, nothing happened. It was darkness. We have documents. We have like literally this text we're about to look at. So it's not like it's in darkness. It's not like nothing happened. And it's not like there was a complete idiocy. All right, was there? Yeah, sure. Was it universal? No. But, I mean, you could look at today. I mean, is there a lot of stupidity out in the world? Yes. Is there a lot of brilliance as well? Yeah. You have to look for it. It seems like you have to look for it a little bit more deeply. Same thing here. Okay, sure, there's idiocy and superstition, right? Rampant superstition, but there is today too, and there is in the ancient world. So I'll just say this before we get into stuff in the Middle Ages. Be careful not to be a chronological snob and go into reading a historical text, something from the past, under the assumption that these people in the past must have been complete idiots. I think we do ourselves a disservice when we do that. Obviously, there's limitations to being before certain technologies and things like that. That's obvious, but there are other things where I think people in the past may have been advantageous. Sometimes, especially in their memorized knowledge. I'm covetous of that. But the one thing that I want to get into where the writings of Thomas in particular can seem difficult is in what's called the scholastic method. So I want to look at a page here in Thomas and explain the method before we really even get into it. So the first thing here, and so this is this giant work, Summa Theologica, Summa Theologiae, depending on which version that you have. Two giant books, all right, and then the second half is split itself into two parts. Why isn't the first half split into two parts? I honestly don't know. Typically, if this is in printed volumes, it's usually about at least 5. But let's take a look. Let me get into, here we go. So like one of these here. So here we go. Second part of the second part, question 40. Second part, part 2, question 40, 2240. That is where Thomas Aquinas takes up the subject of war. And the way that Thomas asks these questions, I want to point out. Okay, so actually let me tweak my view here a little bit. I'm going to go, let's look at one page at a time. There we go. So what he does here is, you'll notice question 40, all right, actually is a couple of questions, all right? And he says this, 4 articles here in question 40. And so the whole thing is about war. And he says basically there are about 4 things that we can ask. Okay, question 1, is some kind of war ever lawful? And like it's not a little technical language, but basically he says one question we can ask, is it ever okay for people to go to war? 1. Second question, is it ever okay for the clerical class, this is a very medieval question, is it ever permissible for the clerical class to fight and be part of combat? Third question, is it lawful for people in warfare to do things like lay ambushes, right, surprise attacks? Is that ever permissible? Not that people do or don't do it, but should they? And also, fourth question, is it lawful to fight on holy days? Okay, certain days of the week and of the year and of the calendar. Can you go to war on those days? Okay, so now I think the second and fourth question to me seem particularly medieval. Okay, and I don't say that as a chronological slob. It seems snob, excuse me. I like the idea of a chronological slob, but that wasn't intended. I don't mean to be a chronological snob looking backwards going, oh, can you believe they argued about what days of the week to fight on? That's happened recently as well, in modern times. Like, can we, sometimes it's anecdotal, but you've heard stories about, I'm sure, about World War I, everybody stopping fighting on, Christmas Day, and people do it, like, that persists, okay? Now, there's a mythic component to that, perhaps, but I've heard some anecdotes that seem to confirm that kind of, those kind of events happening. And I believe there are some documented instances of that occurring, but we can't do certain things on certain days. Certain days are considered more precious than others, even for military exercise. So that's not merely a medieval problem, but in terms of talking about it being sacred or holy, and that there's some sort of moral inability to do that, that seems to be a medieval problem. And typically we don't think about clergy as being a problem of them being combatants. However, keep in mind, even in the United States military, there are still chaplains. There is a clerical class in the United States military. And furthermore, we kind of treat medics today also as kind of a separate class. Is it appropriate for someone who's a medic in battle to either be shot upon or to take up arms and become a combatant? Someone who's a medic or a cleric, for that matter. And there are certain international agreements, like the Geneva Conventions, which make stipulations that are based on a lot of these points that actually Thomas starts here. So actually, there's a lot of things in Thomas that end up being kind of the bases for international law and talking about war. Now, we have international law, and there hasn't been a world war since a lot of the things like the Geneva Conventions and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but have there still been conflicts by all over the world, and even including Western powers? Yeah, but not with the same kind of magnitude, and perhaps there's a Thomistic reason for that. Well, So that's that. These are the questions that he has in view. The ones that I'm interested in are really the first one and the third one. So that's what we're going to look at. But I think most of them are here. And here's what he does. So I'm going to use the first one here as an example in terms of looking at the method. So I want to explain the method. First of all, there is a question. So let's take a look. Whether it is always sinful to wage war. This is actually a recapitulation of the first question. Here it's couched in the positive, right? Whether some kind of war is lawful. Here it's put into the down here it's put into the negative in a slightly different wording. Whether it is always sinful to wage war. Now, before I get into this, into the particulars of how Thomas Aquinas answers the question, I want to talk about Thomas Aquinas' method. Okay, so let me explain now Aquinas' scholastic method. So what he'll do is he'll ask, first of all, you'll have this. Okay, he did this thing we already talked about. There's the general topic. All right, so there's the notion of topic. So we're talking about on the topic of war, and that's part two, question 40. That's what we're looking at here. Okay, and so there's the topic. I've already addressed that. Then he'll ask a particular kind of question. All right, so that's the next thing. He'll ask a question, whatever it is. Like, what is war sinful? Is it always wrong? Okay. Then here's the method. Okay, and this methodology is something we still kind of I'll say this: the basic essay format, where you have a topic, and you spend X amount of paragraphs backing it up, and then you have a conclusion. That is basically a very watered down version of this method. Okay, so you got your question, and the question is a thesis put in the form of a question. Okay, so is it ever right to wage war? Usually the answer is going to be yes. Okay, not always. Maybe I shouldn't say usually there, but there will be a specific question. Then there will be, however the question is asked. So in this case, the first one is it always sinful to wage war? Is war always bad? Immediately, the first thing you will see are objections. So this is the first thing you'll see. Now, I want to be careful here, and this is where it can get very confusing to read Thomas. The points here that are objections are not Thomas's views. They are potential objections one could make to the question. It's not necessarily an endorsement from Thomas. It's just saying these are reasons why someone might be against war. So, for example, that first question where he says, is war always wrong? He might the objections are going to be like, here's why someone might say it's always wrong, it's always wrong, it's always wrong, and he might do some things that echo Mozi to some degree. Not really, but he's saying here's potential objections. Here's why people might say, yeah, it's always wrong, and answer that question in the affirmative. Then he does this. Part two, the second thing he does is this thing called the contrario, which is Latin for I say on the contrary. And usually in the English there you'll see it where it'll say on the contrary. What he does here is whatever the position is in the objections. Okay, so if the question is talking about war, what you'll see in the objections is a list of, A, B, C, D reasons why war is bad, at least when it comes to this first question. Now, in the contrario, what happens is, in the contrario, there is something that goes against the arguments of the objections from some kind of authority. Now, the authority might be a philosopher. It might be something from Scripture. It might be something from one of the church fathers or some other authority in the church. Not that Thomas would say that all those things are equivalent by any means. Even though he gets, by some Protestants, Luther to some degree, the claim is that, Thomas and the Catholic Church all kind of view Aristotle as on par with Scripture. That is a gross overstatement. But nevertheless, he would look at an authority here and say, what does an authoritative figure say to the contrary of the objections that I just talked about? Okay? And usually in some specific way. So it's not that it can be like, okay, the objections were war is bad, so the contrary is going to be like, oh, here's where the Bible says war is good. No. Usually it'll be some limited sense. So it'll be in what sense, okay, would war be good? Okay, that would be on the contrary. And here, the first question, he appeals to Augustine. Right, good person. He goes to Augustine a lot. Okay, so what does Augustine have to say about it? So we'll get into the text in a moment, but I want to explain the method first. All right, the next thing is the responsio. And in your English text, it says, "I answered that." Okay, like I'm responding. Okay, not responsia, responsio. Okay, there we go. He's saying this part right here. This is the most important part. There's a certain sense in which you could really read nothing but this. That's what Thomas is saying. Now you miss a lot of the context. Okay, but the responsio is him saying, "I answer that." Okay, so again, contrario is some, appealing to some authority, like you might, just like you might dump in footnotes and say, "Well, so and so said this." The responsio is, I'll put it this way: it's here's what I think. That's really, Thomas is stating his own view here. So he's done like here's the topic. All right, here's the specific question, or kind of, it's not exactly a thesis, but that's what he's getting at. Here's some reasons why people might object. Here's where they might think the other way, on the other hand, okay, which you typically do in an introductory paragraph. Then he gets into, here's what I think on the matter. All right, and this is where Thomas puts forth his own positions in these responsio segments. Okay, so it's not the other stuff he might be quoting, here's what someone else might have said on the matter. The responsio is the I answer that. It's Thomas talking. All right, so sometimes I've seen people misquote Thomas by saying, "Oh, Thomas Aquinas says this," and it's like, "Oh no, what you just did there was you quoted Thomas's objection. You weren't actually quoting Thomas's position." It's kind of like, if you see, like, occasionally people will have, I think I've said this before, but people have coffee mugs with like Bible verses on them, and I've seen them before where it says, something out of the Gospel of Matthew would be like, if you just bow before me, I will add all these, the kingdoms of the world to you, and yeah, oh yeah, that's cute, that's from the Bible. Yeah, that's Satan talking in the temptation of Christ in the wilderness. It sounds good out of context, but you don't realize what you literally just quoted Satan. Good job. All right, probably not realizing it. All right, that's what we can go on here. So just keep in mind the responsio segments, which to that first question, the substance of what Thomas is saying, even though it looks like a lot of text, that's only 3 paragraphs to that first question. Okay, so that's what I want to get at. This method looks a lot more dense than it really is, and once you get the method, you kind of see what he's doing. You're like, oh, okay. But it almost plays out like a game where if you go into I remember the first time I read Thomas Aquinas, I was like, what is he doing? What are these objections here? So understanding the method helps you understand the reasoning. And then the fourth part, and this is kind of weird in terms of placement, are the replies to objections. So, if there were objections listed above, no matter how many, okay, if there were 3, then down here there will be 3 replies, all right, where he will answer. All right, so if someone said up here, here's one reason why war is bad, expect there to be a corresponding one down here. This person said war is bad. Here's my particular reply to that objection. Someone said, 2, here's the reason why war is bad. Well, down here, expect a corresponding reply to that objection, and so on. Okay, so the replies to the objections happen on the back end. So again, the scholastic method is this format, and again, our basic essay structure today is really a watered down, reduced version of this. You have the topic, you take the question, you posit objections to the question. You then take the objections and immediately think of a counterexample from some authoritative figure or authoritative text. Aha, but this says this. And so you set up kind of like what looks like, it looks like there's a tension there. That's the point of that. And then the responsio, you go for clarity. You say, here's my view. And then finally, you reply to objections. Here's why those initial potential objections are mistaken or an error, but he replies to them. So now that we know that's the method, I think we can approach the text and the question with a little bit more confidence going in terms of what's going on. So now, knowing that, let's go ahead and go back to the text and tackle that first question. And we'll take a look at some of the objections, but really the kernel of what's going on there is in that responsio. Let's do it. All right. In that case, let's consider the first question. Diinde considerandum est di bello. Let's consider: is it always sinful, or is it always lawful, or two positive and negative ways of looking at the same question, to wage war? And then we have a list of reasons. So, or objections. So, again, following that now, look, there are 4 objections. So, you can, right there, you just learned how many replies. You don't even have to turn the page. You know exactly how many replies there are going to be. And I don't want to focus too much on the replies. I really want to focus mainly on his response here, where he says, I answer that, because that's Thomas's own position. He says, but we'll just take a look at it. Objection 1, for example. It would seem that it's always sinful to wage war. Someone might say it's always wrong. You should be a pacifist. Because punishment is not inflicted except for sin. So you shouldn't punish unless there's a wrong. Now, those who wage war are threatened by our Lord with punishment. According to Matthew 26:52, all that take the sword shall perish with the sword. Therefore, all wars are unlawful. So you might take it, like he just said there. He just quoted Jesus in the objection. All right, you might say, war's always wrong. Well, how could you say that? Well, did not Jesus say, if you go to war, if all who take up the sword shall die by the sword? Kind of sounds like an indictment of war to me. And that's what he says in the objection. Now, for the sake of just going there and taking a look at it, if we zoom down to the reply to objection 1, which is also on the same page, but if you zoom further down, he's going to immediately give his response. Now, here's why that's wrong. All right, reply to objection 1, and we'll just look at it for the sake of going over. I don't want to go over every objection, but I want you to at least understand the method. So there's kind of this chiastic way of looking at objections and the replies, where it's on the bookend and on the front end. That's kind of, by that I mean like a way of doing it with like these echoes. So on the end, he says, all right, here's the deal. Augustine says, to take the sword is to arm oneself in order to take the life of anyone, without the command or permission of superior or lawful authority. On the other hand, to have recourse to the sword as a private person by the authority of the sovereign, or the public person through zeal for justice and by the authority, so to speak, of God, is not to take the sword, but to use it as commissioned by another, wherefore it does not deserve punishment. So he qualified it. So listen, he just said there, yes, prima facie, on the surface, it can sound like when you hear the Bible verse, you take up the sword, you'll die by the sword. Kind of sounds like then all taking up the sword is wrong all the time. And he says, no, as Augustine has already pointed out, taking up the sword is basically participating in violence as an individual. Okay, if someone wrongs you and you're like, that's it, I'm going to kill him. That's wrong. It's different. Now, you might, we know Motsu would disagree. No, Motsu would immediately say here, no, no, it's not. But Augustine is saying, at least in this Christian conceptualization, and Thomas is saying this, channeling Augustine, that's not wrong, because God has been given all authority, yes? And if God's been given authority, and authority has been even given to, civil powers, and that civil power comes from God, and those civil powers delegate to, say, the military, or this is in the ancient world, sometimes the power of the sword means the power to enforce law through punitive measures, through punishment, okay, and also through violence is it works, or it's permissible, because ultimately that authority is coming from God through some kind of say ratified institution, not ratified by people, but ratified by God. So the institution of the family would be considered a legitimate authority. Ecclesial, the basically religious institutions would be considered legitimate authority. Not necessarily in the church, but they would understand, for example, ancient Israel did have the authority to go out and use the sword in the ancient world, all right, say going into Canaan, and so on. And then the institution of the state also is a divinely ordained institution that has certain powers and functions. So he's saying that would be the reply to objection 1. No, you can't use that one verse by itself to say that war is always wrong, because if you understand the verse rightly, you will see that there are various exceptions. All right, just based on, you can't just take one thing. The basic Thomistic advice here is good. You can't just take one thing out of the Bible out of context and then get it to mean what you want it to mean without looking at it contextually. I think that's true with any text. You can't just take one line and be like, aha, there it is. Got what I wanted out of it. don't do that. All right, so I think that's helpful, even if you might object to the ultimate conclusion that Thomas is drawing from this. You may not. That's not the point. I do think the principle here of you can't just take one thing out of context is good. All right, but the other objections, frankly, I don't care about here in this context. Let's take a look at what he says. All right, then he gives the contrary, appealing to Augustine again. Augustine says, all right, so here's ways you might say war is wrong. Augustine says, in the Sermon on the Son of the Centurion, if the Christian religion forbade war altogether, those who sought salutary advice in the gospel would rather have been counseled to cast aside their arms and to give up soldiering altogether. On the contrary, they were told, do violence to no man and be content with your pay. If he commanded them to be content with their pay, he did not forbid soldiering. Now listen, Thomas is quoting Augustine here, but here's where he said war is obviously permissible. And he gives the reference there is in the Gospel of Luke chapter 3. So a Roman soldier, this is not the centurion who says, surely this is the Christ, all right? But a Roman soldier, centurion, goes up to Jesus and says, hey, I'm trying to remember the exact, I think he says like one of his soldiers needs healing. And he says, well, Jesus, one of my soldiers needs some healing. Will you heal him? I believe that's the context going on here. And regardless, Jesus says, all right, he gives some advice here. I believe the person that the centurion wanted to be healed gets healed because he has respect for the way in which Jesus gives it, like almost like a military command. Yeah, it's done. But then also Jesus gives him particular advice. He says, don't really, when it's do violence to no man, yourself. All right, so don't go around bullying people. All right, yourself. Like just because you're a soldier doesn't mean you get to pick fights with people with your gladius. Okay, you do violence to no man. Also, stop complaining about your pay. All right, you get enough money. All right, so be content with your pay. Don't do any kind of violence on your own. Now, Augustine's saying here, if Jesus had been entirely against warfare, wholeheartedly, when the soldier asked Jesus for some advice or, hey, please, I put in a request for healing for someone else, if Jesus were really against warfare, he would have stopped and been like, I can't do anything for you until you lay down your sword and go AWOL and quit being in the military. So Augustine's argument is, if Jesus had said that, then we could make a deduction. Jesus is against war. God is against war. War is never permissible. But he didn't do that. We can think of other instances where Jesus tells people, stop doing what you're doing. Okay? Go and sin no more. Okay? You brood of vipers. Okay? So Jesus is not, in any gospel, has no problem with telling people what he thinks. Okay? Even when he's on trial with Pilate, all right, in the Gospel of John, like, you could not do anything without him handing me, who has all authority, handing me over to you. You can't do anything unless God allows it. So I'm in charge here. He says that to Pilate. So Jesus has no problem, being shy about what he thinks in any of the gospel accounts. But so the conclusion then is Jesus is obviously not completely against war, but as a notion. So there's no such thing. There really can't be an argument for absolute pacifism. Says Thomas here, channeling Augustine, doing a particular interpretation of, in this case, the Gospel of Luke. Okay, so now let's get into the responsio, the I answer that, because this is where Thomas is really telling us his own position. And you'll notice it's 3 paragraphs, okay, where we've got, and I like the ordinal organization of Thomas here. So he says, this is the, right here, I answer that. That's the responsio. I answer that, then secondly, thirdly. So let's take this point by point. So let's take a look at this. Because he gives us a bunch of criteria here that I think is really helpful and still kind of persists in international law today, okay, by way of Grotius and some others. But look at what he says here. Okay, now, He says, in order for a war to be just, three things are necessary. Okay? Tria requiruntur. Okay, three things are necessary. Well, okay, so let's start making a list. Primo. All right, what's the first thing? Um, the authority of the sovereign by whose command the war is to be waged. The authority of the sovereign by whose the command the war is to be waged. So, what did he just say there? All right, that seems a bit unclear. So the first task is this: if war is going to be waged, it has to be waged by a legitimate authority. That's criteria number one. So consider this, and this has come up in history before. Like, who can go to war? And so, not just like, for example, in the history of the United States, who can declare war? Really, only Congress declares war. Now, as I said in the last, the stuff that we were doing with Mozart, in spite of the Congress only declaring war, being the only power that can declare war, it seems like the United States has nevertheless been in a bunch of wars. But the idea is still that, well, on some level where it's the executive doing it through some sort of executive privilege or pronunciation or orders of some kind as commander-in-chief, which is particular to the American construction, or it's Congress declaring war, it seems like I think we would agree that there are some institutions that simply it would not be permissible for them to go to war legitimately. Here's what I mean by that. In the past, it's come up, let's... Obviously, I think this came up most obviously in the American Civil War, where, if you're the Army of Northern Virginia, you're not the United States Army, all right? And you're not really, and sure, we had the United States had a whole war over that, of going, can really states have their own militaries do their own things? And you see that in the command structures in the American Civil War. That's one thing. But, even today, let's say that the Georgia National Guard, all right, I live on this side of the river, so let's say the Georgia National Guard, could they just decide, you know what, we're going to invade Mexico? No. Or if they did, that would be it would be in no way commensurable with their authority. Or if they decide to go to war with another state all of a sudden, like Georgia's like, you know what, we're invading South Carolina. We've had it. Okay. Now here I'm still dealing with state powers, but what if I said something like this? What if I said like the Atlanta Falcons have decided to go to war with the United States military? Now, maybe it's no contest, but how? And even let's assume, they've got a lot of money, so they might be able to buy some serious weapons. But how? How could that even happen? So that would not be warfare based on a legitimate authority. So Aquinas is at least saying here, telling us that if war is going to be waged, it has to be done by legitimate authority. You're one of the student organizations on campus, like one of the fraternities, couldn't all of a sudden say, you know what, we are declaring war on the sovereign kingdom of Denmark. You could, but you have no authority to really do so. No one's going to take it seriously, right? And where does this still come up then? Well, remember, there are some countries that exist in the world that certain other countries will acknowledge and others will not, and that's been a big deal over the years. Whether it be, I can think like of a couple of countries where we either do acknowledge or don't acknowledge the legitimate authority there. Something like whether it be China acknowledging the existence of Taiwan, certain countries in the Middle East acknowledging the existence of Israel, Israel acknowledging the existence of Palestinian territories, or other countries acknowledging that. So that still comes up in terms of acknowledging, what's legitimate and what's not, what's a legitimate authority and what not. And sometimes a group will come along where, it will be said, that's not a legitimate authority. They don't have the wherewithal to be able to make claims or go to war or something like that. Like, say, with the Viet Cong in Vietnam, were they a legitimate authority? Now here, remember, who are the Viet Cong? That's not in the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong are not the North Vietnamese army. They are sort of a collection of those in South Vietnam who were opposing originally the French presence and later the American presence in South Vietnam. You'll know if you look on a map today. There's just a Vietnam, right? But that Viet Cong, they're not a legitimate authority. Okay, I consider this too. This has come up really in all of your lifetimes since I mentioned the wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and like back in 2001, who was responsible for the September 11th attacks in September 11th, 2001, and it seems like okay, it was a lot of people of Saudi nationality that were nevertheless being somehow this was orchestrated with the Taliban, which was an organization kind of in charge of Afghanistan, but it wasn't the proper Afghanistan government, but it was also a terrorist organization called Al Qaeda, which isn't exactly, it's not a country. Like Al Qaeda is not a state. And even today, Al Qaeda, through what was going on with Osama bin Laden, and later through Zarqawi in Iraq, and then later through Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, eventually parts of Al Qaeda in Iraq evolved into this thing that you remember, ISIS or ISIL, all right, the Islamic State, Daesh, whatever you want to call it. Is it a country? They kind of think they are, but you won't see it on a map. So is it a legitimate authority? And sometimes the international crowd has to scratch their heads and go, this is not a legitimate entity. Okay, so this still comes up, saying war has to be waged by legitimate powers. Okay, so like I said, the Atlanta Falcons can't just decide to go to war with the Boy Scouts Association of America. You can't do that. It has to be waged by legitimate authorities. That's question number one. The sovereigns have to, and of course, in a Christian conceptualization here, and a medieval hierarchical organization, really all authority comes from God. So if it's coming out of something that's an illegitimate authority, they don't have the power to do so. Okay? You don't have the authority to do so. Because that authority has not been delegated to what? So only legitimate authorities can wage war. Okay? And then this. 4, it is not the business of a private individual to declare war. You can't decide to declare war. I know we can talk about that colloquially. All right, we say, I'm going to war with this. And I know I mentioned like a sports team earlier. It was a war. I think of, I'm thinking of the novel The Chosen by Chaim Patak, where there's, it's not war, but this other team, these teams are playing baseball, and the team coming up, they're gonna murder you, and they really are intense. Now they don't plan to murder anybody else in this novel, but there is a sense of like intense rivalry. But you can't declare war on people. For all the metaphors that we can use, you can't do that. And if you do, like I'm going to declare war on my neighbor and I'm going to kill them and take their things, that's murder. So you're going to jail. You don't have the authority to do that. But private individuals can't declare war because you can seek for redress of their rights from the tribunal of the superior. If something wrong happens to you as a citizen, you have conduits through which you can have that redressed. So if someone, for example, let's say someone starts, doing something on your lawn, you can sue. There are things that you can do. There are ways where the authorities that are in place, you can use them through proper channels to do what you need to do to redress wrongs. You can go to civil court. You can sue. You can go to criminal court. You can press charges against somebody. So you as a private individual, if someone wrongs you or your stuff, there are means that exist for you to take care of that, and you should go about those means. Okay. Period. Okay, and you go to the person above you, whether it's the king, okay, or it's the judge, or what have you. You have a place you can go. You go upward to your superior, and you say, "You help me out with that." Now, in this feudal time, it's going to be probably the particular kind of with the vassalage system, the particular lord above you, whether it's your baron, your count, your duke, your king, what have you. Go to them and say, "Hey, I've been wronged here. It's within your jurisdiction to redress this wrong," and it is the one of the duties of those authorities to redress that wrong. Hey, here, Bob, it sounds like you stole one of Sam's sheep. Well, we're gonna have to make up for that somehow. So whether it be punitive damages or There's something that has to happen. Whatever the result is, there's an authority that exists that part of their duty is to divvy out that kind of recompense and deal with those kinds of issues. That's the point. But moreover, it is not the business of a private individual to summon together the people, which has to be done in wartime. So you can't have people congregate together into a militia or an army. That's not your job. Okay, you don't form mobs. You don't do that. Okay, people above you do that. All right, when there's a call to arms, right, or calling of the banners or something like that. And you can't just do that on your own. Now, doesn't that kind of sound like protesting an assembly? Maybe it does, but that's not a medieval idea. Okay, in fact, if it's going to be Protestantism and it's protesting, that's going to really start, I think, maybe unintentionally, some of those ideas of these more radical notions of freedom that we have today. Again, I don't think that was intentional by the Protestant reformers, but that ends up being a result of it. But here, yeah, you don't make a gang, okay, out of people. You don't do that, okay, as a private individual, just an individual. Like, oh well, you know what, we've had enough. If there's a legitimate channel of recourse that exists, you go about that, okay. That's what it's there for. And he continues with some reasoning, and as the care of the common weal, okay, common weal, not wheel with WH, weal. That's where we get the word commonwealth. All right, that common well-being. You could think of it that way. Our well-being altogether is committed to those who are in authority. It is their business to watch over the commonwealth of the city, kingdom, or province subject to them. So if you had like a little subtle objection there when you hear that, wait a minute, you say go through the proper channels. What if the proper channels aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing? Thomas just said here, nevertheless, it is the responsibility of those in authority to deal with this for the common weal of all. That's their job. And so that presupposition is there. You know, if you've got the proper recourse, there's a certain sense in which Thomas is saying, assuming everything's working rightly, the way that it should, this is how you do it. Now, well, what if you do if it's not working rightly? I think you can look at Thomas's stuff on natural law to come to the conclusions there. Okay, but that would be a separate matter of discourse that would take too long to get through. But he goes on, and just as it is lawful for them to have recourse to the sword in defending that commonweal against internal disturbances, when they punish evildoers, according to the words of the apostle, Romans 13. All right, so he says, just as it's appropriate for, and here we'll say, for the lack of a better word, the state, for the sake of its own defense. Okay, I think of the, preamble to the Constitution. Okay, to provide for the common defense. Similar language here, since it's the duty of the sovereign to protect the commonwealth against internal disturbances, and you can kind of punish people internally for the sake of internal protection. Since that's fine, and we get that from the Bible, Romans 13, then, and he quotes it there, and he quotes some of the Psalms. So too, it is the business to have recourse of the sword in war, defending the commonweal against external enemies. Hence it is said to the poor, hence it is said to those who are in authority, rescue the poor and deliver the needy out of the hand of the sinner. And so for this reason, Augustus says in Contra Faustus, the natural order conducive to peace among mortals demands that the power to declare and counsel war should be in the hands of those who hold the supreme authority. Okay, there we go. Part one. Has to be a legitimate authority doing the declaring of war, but the authority in power also has particular duties. Now, to be able to be there to perform those kinds of matters of redress internally, but also, since it protects internally, and that's one of its tasks, so too is it also the task to protect against external threats. But notice, while I'm not sure Motze would agree with the reasoning here, even though they're divorced by many centuries, they had no interaction whatsoever. Nevertheless, notice the language that Thomas employs here. He says, it is their business to have recourse to the sword of war in defending the commonweal against external enemies. So notice that the language there is defense. Okay, defending yourself is fine against external enemies. Okay, so the enemies are out there. Now, there's one way I'm sure this could be interpreted to mean, well, if their enemies are out there and they exist, then we can obviously go after them. But the language seems to be, I think, fairly clear that it's wars of defense are appropriate for the sake of the commonweal. Okay. That's the first part. Let's go ahead and get into the second part. The second thing that Thomas Aquinas says about what would make a war just. All right, the second thing, secundo, requiretur causa justa. This, a just cause is required. So in order to go to war, one, it has to be by a legitimate authority. Two, there has to be a just cause, justa, a justification. There has to be a good reason for going to war. Namely, that those who are attacked should be attacked because they deserve it on account of some fault. So here, it sounds like as long as you have some reason to go to war. So what's a sufficient reason to go to war? And he quotes Augustine here saying, quoting Augustine, he says, a just war is wont to be described as one that avenges wrongs, when a nation or state has to be punished for refusing to make amends for the wrongs inflicted by its subjects, or to restore what it has seized unjustly. So, by way of channeling Augustine there, Aquinas has actually given us two reasons that would be a just cause for war. Okay, when there has to be a state refuses to make amends for the wrongs inflicted by its subjects. So a state, maybe whether it be the authority of the state or people in the state are doing something they shouldn't be doing, and they're not addressing it, that has to be fixed. Or when a state has seized something unjustly. So what would be a just cause for war then? Based on that criteria. And think about this in the modern era, because again, like I said before, a lot of notions of international law really follow this Thomistic line of reasoning here, that a war is only legitimate if there's a just cause. So, for example, seizing something unjustly. Think of the Third Reich, all right, Nazi Germany, deciding to annex parts of Europe pretty much capriciously. The Sudetenland, right? Parts of France, parts of Poland, Austria, seizing authority or seizing territory unjustly, all right? Whether it be by blitzkrieg or some other means. That's where certain lines were crossed, where at the time, World War II, at least in Europe, for many parties, for the United States, we think of December 8th, 1941, and that's when the American declaration of war happens against the Empire of Japan because of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, that would be by the Empire of Japan, that would be a wrong inflicted by its subjects through the authority of the Japanese emperor and its generals, Tojo Hirohito. Tojo being the general, Hirohito being the emperor. That's a wrong being redressed. Okay, one could argue. Or in 1939, various European powers saying, "All right, Nazi Germany, all right, you've crossed the line now. You can't do this anymore. This seizing of territory has to stop." Okay. So that would be a cause for legitimate war. So seizing of things that aren't yours, you're saying, "Oh, this is yours." Is that a good reason for going to war? Say recently, Russia went into Crimea in the Ukraine, seizing territory. Was that just? I'm sure many in Ukraine don't think so. But so there's been that kind of conflict. Is that appropriate, seizing various territories? It comes up when we're talking about the relationship between Israel and Palestine. Is the seizing of territories or settlements, and we can talk about the notion of retaliation there. That actually comes up in the third aspect. But at least here, the two good reasons for going to war, the two just reasons. If you don't meet this criteria, you don't have a just war, and you ought not go to war. That's the argument. Okay, but if you're making someone make amends for wrongs they've done, or you're restoring what has been seized unjustly, that's appropriate. And those are just causes for war. So I want you to think at particular wars in history. Are they just or not? Based on this criteria, and I think we can think of a few that are. Maybe not objectively, and at least in terms of now, notice we're talking here about the reasons for going to war. We're not talking about the final results, okay, or certain actions in war. That hasn't come up yet. Okay, the reasons for going to war are this. Okay, do you go to war just because you want other people's stuff? Like, remember, Motsu was talking about offensive war. There is no way that an offensive war, just to acquire stuff, could be justified on these grounds. That's Thomas's point here. That doesn't work. Like, my neighbor has stuff. They've got mines. I want their gold mines. I'm going to invade them to take their gold mines. Nope. That's not a sufficient reason to go to war. So these are the sufficient reasons or justifications for going to war. You have to meet this criteria in order for a war to be just, according to Thomas. Okay, so that's, again, we're now 2 criteria deep. Criteria number 1, it has to be a legitimate authority. Criteria number 2, it has to have a just cause, meaning that a state has to be punished for refusing to make amends for the wrongs inflicted by its subjects, or there has to be a restoration of what has been unjustly seized. And finally, tertio, part 3, third aspect. It is necessary that the belligerents, that is, those that are going to war here, okay, again, the Latin word for war is bellum. Okay. Those going to war, the belligerents, should have a rightful intention. So last time we talked about legitimate authority, we talked about just cause. They need to have a rightful intention so that they intend the advancement of good or the avoidance of evil. So going into war, all right, a party that has to meet the criteria of that just cause element. So a legitimate authority going into war for the right causes, all right, to redress wrongs or to take back stuff that was unjustly seized. They have to go in with rightful intention. And so what's that good intention? Third intention, bonum promoveatur, vel et malum vitetur. Okay, the promotion of good and the avoidance of evil. He also quotes Augustine again here, saying, true religion looks upon as peaceful those wars that are waged not for motives of aggrandizement or cruelty, but with the object of securing peace, of punishing evildoers and uplifting the good. The purpose of war is to maintain and preserve goodness and to get rid of, to extricate evil. Really, getting rid of evildoers, punishing evildoers. That's the point of warfare. It's not for the purposes of aggrandizement, as Augustine said. Okay, so Thomas continues, for it may happen that war is declared, now consider the scenario, it may happen that the first 2 criteria happen. War is declared by legitimate authority and for a just cause, and yet be rendered unlawful through a wicked intention. Hence, Augustine says, again from Contra Faustus, the passion for inflicting harm, the cruel thirst for vengeance, an unpacific and relentless spirit, the fervor of revolt, the lust of power, and such like things, all these are rightly condemned in war. So let's consider that. And so what would that mean here, too? Okay, look at that list of reasons that Augustine gave there. Okay, wanting to inflict harm, the desire. Okay, what is the purpose here, the function of war? To stop wrongdoing. Sometimes war gets the Gets phrased as, it's a necessary evil. That's not what Thomas is talking about here. He doesn't describe it as a necessary evil. Neither does he declare this to be like some sort of joyous occurrence. He's not talking about like a notion of holy war here. And they were like, oh, God wills it. All right, did that happen in the Middle Ages? Yes. Deus vult. Okay. Deo volente. God wills it. God wills that we invade these people for some reason. Now, sometimes there were justifications, like say in the Crusades, the idea was, oh, the Islamic invaders have taken over the Holy Land. That's precious to us. Legitimate authority? The nations of Europe. Just cause? Territory was seized that before had not belonged to the caliphate. Right intention? No way. Okay, brutal. If we're talking about we can go to war for right reasons. War crimes? No. So this is an indictment really against war crimes and the attitude of war. What are you trying to do? Are you trying to stop the wrong of the enemy? Or are you trying to be vindictive? And consider that war not only often involves murder, and I don't just mean the killing of enemy combatants. I mean sometimes just cold-blooded murder, sometimes rape, sometimes thievery, sometimes vicious brutality that is the epitome of human cruelty. To which Thomas and Augustine here both say, no, not that. That's not war. That is condemned, to be condemned. And listen to the list that Augustine gave here, which Thomas quotes. The purpose of inflicting harm, and you could think of instances we're going to show these bastards what we're made of. You can meet the first two criteria. You doing that? You're doing it wrong. The thirst for vengeance. Not only that, like they've wronged us, we're gonna make them pay. Wrong. You're in the wrong. You might have had right reasons. You might be a legitimate authority, have right reasons for going to war. If you're going in with that attitude, you're wrong. Whether it be the people in authority or the troops on the ground. Now you're doing it wrong. Not a just war. If you're going in with a thirst for vengeance, we're going to make them pay. An unpacific and relentless spirit. Unpacific? What's pacific? Wanting peace. Your goal is not, if your goal is going in, you don't want peace. But you want to be relentless. Like, no, we're going to make that. We're like, I'm bred to war. I'm bred to conflict. We're going to make this happen. It's going to go on for eons. We're going to hate it. The hate is going to go on. You're doing it wrong. The fervor of revolt. We're going to keep doing things to make this continue perpetual. You're doing it wrong. The lust of power. All right, so conflict breeds all kinds of vacuums where people can come in and swoop in. This happens throughout history. I think you see this. I think if you look at the Dreißigjährige Krieg, the 30 Years' War in Europe, 1648. There's all these instances of like it's a Game of Thrones level backstabbing where you have it's Protestants versus Catholics, and sometimes the team ups there don't work exactly how you would think they would. Where sometimes like on paper, the 30 Years' War, again 1618, 1648, is ostensibly between the Catholic Habsburgs in Central Europe, okay, Germany, Austria, and the Protestants in Northern Europe. On paper, that's what it looks like. But things happen where, like, the French Catholics would fund, like under Cardinal Richelieu, remember the bad guy in the Three Musketeers? Cardinal Richelieu would help fund the Protestants. He's a Catholic. He's a Catholic cardinal. There was some support of the Protestants against the Holy Roman Empire because the Holy Roman Empire was an enemy to France as a state. So if they could be messed with and the Habsburg family's possessions could be messed with, it would be better for the Bourbon Catholic dynasty of France. Coincidentally, the Bourbons had actually originally, Henry IV, the first Bourbon king, had become king of France by renouncing his Protestant faith and becoming a Catholic. So you have all these weird team-ups, okay? And the idea is all the lust for, certain people, the head of Catholic forces early on in the 30 Years' War is Albrecht von Wallenstein, and I think he gets assassinated at one point. Like he's the Catholic general, but he ends up getting too powerful, so powerful that we've got to let him go. We've got to take him. He has to get taken out. It's just ruthless. And these notions of lusting for power, getting into war for how much I can possess, wrong. And also, I like how Augustine says, and such like things. This list is not exhaustive. And he says these things are to be condemned in war. So those are the three criteria for a just war. And I want you to think about how much Thomas is saying here. In the Middle Ages, which we think of, again, I think wrongly, as perpetually constant conflict, nonsense, and superstition, and I'm not saying any of those things aren't there. Yeah, they are in the Middle Ages, but they're here now in the 21st century as well. I want to keep that in mind. But Thomas is at least saying here, think this if you're going to go to war, you got to meet these criteria. And this persists again in just cause thinking today. This came up in the Iraq War in 20 years ago. Okay, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, he has weapons of mass destruction. Okay, United States, legitimate authority. However, what came up, hey, like the United States wants to go to war with Iraq, but there's not a global consensus that you can do this. So yeah, the United States wants to do it, but the global community does not. Does that mean there's not really a legitimate, terrestrial authority, right? The whole Earth saying, hey, like maybe you shouldn't do this. That came up as a part of the conflict. All right, was there a just cause? Did Saddam Hussein use chemical weapons on his own people? Yeah, and against the Kurds. Did he do those things? Absolutely. And that stuff came up in the rationale for the war in Iraq. But that really wasn't the cause for going to war in 2003. If you look at whereas, if you take a look at the first Iraq War, which I like calling the 100 Hours War, it was very short. The Iraq War in the early, in the early 1990s, in the first Bush administration, that war happened not because of an ocean of weapons of mass destruction, but because Iraq under Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. And there the idea was, okay, that is territory that has been seized unjustly, and therefore Kuwait needs to be given its territory back. So the United States is going to go to war to restore Kuwait's property and its territory and its sovereignty. Okay, were there protests against that war? Yeah, but that was the idea. That makes sense in just war theory. The second Iraq War, there was a lot of conversation, and don't misinterpret me. I'm not saying here definitively that it is or it is not just. That's not my point. I have my own views on it. If you ask me, I'll tell you it was not. Okay, that's not the point I'm trying to make here at all. The point I'm trying to make is that Thomas is telling us that certain criteria needs to be met for it to be just. That's the point that I want to stress. Okay, it's not the inferences that must be made about particular conflicts, but I want you to think about this as an apparatus which we can use and has been used to figure out whether wars are just or not. Is that, and think about the intention. So, consider the United States in World War II. Was the United States... Why did the United States go to war with Germany? Well, actually, Germany declared war on the United States after the United States declared war on Japan. Was that legitimate? Well, it seems like the United States had already been aiding Britain and France because of what the Third Reich had been doing in Europe, and so it was almost kind of teaming up with the Allies there to say, and including Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, to say what the encroachments that Germany has been making into Europe are inappropriate and need to be redressed. Okay, that was the justification for war there. Otherwise, I mean, had Nazi Germany done anything to the United States directly? No, not directly. But there was an idea there that what Nazi Germany had been doing had to be redressed. Let me say here also, it was not as well known at the time what was going on in the Holocaust. A lot of that stuff about the Holocaust came out after the war. I know we look at it now and include it in World War II history, but a lot of that stuff was not known. The anti-Semitism was, surely, but in terms of the extent of what happened in the camps at Krakow and so on, in Auschwitz, the extent of that was not known until later, really. But nevertheless, there was a just reason for going to war against Nazi Germany and against the Empire of Japan, which had attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, December 7th, 1941. So the idea was there that has to be redressed. They killed people. That has to be redressed. And then also that it looked as though Japan was setting up a complete assault of the Pacific Ocean, such that it was poised to potentially invade the Pacific coast of the United States. Did that happen? No. But then also that must mitigate, therefore, the measure of response in war as well. Okay, so surely, did Japan attack the United States unjustly in the attack on Pearl Harbor? It seems like it did so. Okay, just looking at the data, like that was an unprovoked attack. Not entirely provoked. There were some economic ways in which it had been provoked, but not with violence. But then, like, look at the measure of response. Like, so, it starts with an attack on Pearl Harbor, right? That's how the Pacific theater begins, at least with the United States. It ends with 2 atomic bombs obliterating the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Is that a measured response? Was that for the purpose of advancing good and avoiding evil? I mean, that was. I mean, consider. I know we talk about nuclear proliferation and the prevalence of nuclear weapons. This came up a lot in the Cold War. It still comes up today. What is the only country that's ever used nuclear weapons on people? The United States. Did it do so justly? My question is not, did it go to war justly? Okay, is the United States a legitimate authority? It seems so, based on the criteria, at least that Thomas is using. Did the United States go to war with Japan, the Empire of Japan, for just reasons? That seems so, to redress a wrong. Did the United States have rightful intentions as it executed its will in response and during and in the war? That seems like a tougher question. And I think that's really the toughest question in talking about any war. So you might have the most right reasons for doing something. And this comes up in other ways too. Like, you might have the best reasons for doing something. But did you do it in the right way, even though you had the right reasons for doing it? You might be completely justified in your position going in. But did you behave the right way? Did you do the right things in the activity? You might have had the right reasons for doing something. Did you do it rightly once you were in the action? Once you were in the conflict? Once you were at war? Maybe you were invaded, you're defending goodness. But now defending goodness, you're torturing people. You might have started with the greatest reasons and the best of intentions. Now you're in the wrong. I think, again, Motze has a different way of looking at this entirely. But I think there are aspects of this that I think Motze would agree with, and I think where Thomas would look at Motze and say, you've got a point here. Thomas would disagree, I think, with Motze in saying that, Motze's argument often is, okay, you get the kingdom comes in and the king says you murder your neighbors. And Thomas would say, yeah, but the kingdom is a legitimate authority, and that seems to be the point that Motze is denying, that just because you maximize something outwards. He does not have the same notion of a Christian hierarchical notion of authority. He does not, because he's not a Christian, in fact. So there are a completely different way of looking at the apparatuses which underlie the ways in which these decisions get made and the way these conflicts occur and transpire. But nevertheless, I think there's some ways in which they would look at what each other is saying and go, okay, I see what you're saying. I think you have some points there, but I don't think there would be wholehearted agreement or wholehearted disagreement between the two of them. Now, I have far less to say about the third question. I said the second and fourth questions I'm not really as interested in. But when we look at the third question, is it lawful to lay ambushes in war? One might think, immediately, wait a minute. It's, it's a kind of deception, like deceptive tactics. Okay, whether you're playing it in video games, but or doing something like playing hide and go seek or something like that. Are you lying? Or when people are acting, like on the stage, are they lying? You should always avoid lying, right? You're right. You shouldn't bear false witness. Is it lying to deceive the enemy when it's advantageous? I'm just going to go ahead and say here. Thomas is going to say no. All right. So he'll say here, if we, I'm going to go straight to the response here. He says the object of laying ambushes is in order to deceive the enemy. Is it lying? Yes. In warfare, yeah, it's to deceive. Now, a man may be deceived by another's word or deed in two ways. First, through being told something false, or through the breaking of a promise, and this is always unlawful. So if you say you're going to do something and you don't do it, that's wrong. Now, consider this now in terms of modern warfare, okay? But like, if you say something, you make a promise, and then you don't follow through, that's wrong, okay? You tell somebody something and then you don't follow through with it, that's wrong. That's one way of deception. That's always wrong, period. No one ought to deceive the enemy in this way. Don't say, oh yeah, we're totally going to meet tomorrow. Like, come unarmed, we're going to help you. And then you show up and you're unarmed and we're like, all right, we're going to stab you now. Wrong. That kind of deception is always wrong, even if it is advantageous. It's wrong, period. Thomas says that. No one ought to deceive the enemy in this way, for there are certain rights of war and covenants which ought to be observed even among enemies. Quoting Ambrose there, a friend of Augustine. That's deception type number one. That's always wrong. Now think about, does that ever happen today? Are there anytime someone's deceived by, making a promise and then not following through? That seems like it happens. Okay, that's always wrong, though, according to Thomas here. Point two, though. Secondly, a man may be deceived by what we say or do because we do not declare our purpose or meaning to him. So this is sort of deception by omission. We don't say what we're going to do. So we didn't lie. We just didn't say everything. So it's not like we made a promise and then broke it, but we don't say what we're doing. So, for example, if we say, and I think of the film, the Michael Mann film, The Last of the Mohicans. There's this point in the movie where the British are in this fort. This takes place during the French and Indian War. The British are in this fort, and the French show up, and they say, listen, you have fought bravely, but you must surrender your fort. We will give you safe passage back to your colonies. And so the English are like, okay, or I should say the British. The British are given, safe passage out of their fort back to the coast to go back to England. But what the French had done rather duplicitously is they had gotten their Mohawk allies ready to assault the British troops upon their exit. And so what happens is the British troops leave the fort and they're like, all right, it's really great that the French let us leave here, and then the Mohawks assault them, but the French had basically set it up so that the Mohawks would assault the British as they were leaving. Now, would Augustine say this is right? Or Thomas here? No. Neither Ambrose. Thomas here. No, this would be wrong, because that was a deception where you promised they were going to be let out, and you're like, oh, we didn't do it. Yeah, but you knew what was happening. So there was an intention behind it that would be duplicitous and deceptive and therefore wrong. That's one thing. But there's this here now. He says this. Now, we are not always bound to this, since even in the sacred doctrine, many things have to be concealed, especially from unbelievers, lest they deride it. Okay? Don't give what is holy to dogs. Don't cast pearls before swine. Wherefore much more ought the plan of a campaign to be hidden from the enemy. For this reason, among other things that a soldier has to learn is the art of concealing his purpose lest it come to the enemy's knowledge, as stated in the Book of Strategy by Frontinus. Such like concealment is what is meant by an ambush, which may be lawfully employed in a just war. So this is already in the conditions, assuming a just war is in play. Like, listen, if you don't just go and say, oh, what we're planning to do is we're going to line up our troops here and we're going to do that. Shut up. You don't give away tactics and strategy. You don't do that. Okay? Have a plan. Imagine you're playing a board game and you gave away everything that you were doing, what your plans are. So I'm thinking of playing chess. Like, Oh, I'm doing this now because two new moves from now, I plan to attack your queen. Don't do that. All right. Or every time, like, any game, whatever it is, don't, like, if you're playing a game, you wouldn't give away what you're doing on each turn. You may be able to infer that, but imagine playing poker like that, okay? Oh, I've got three of a kind. And if we're playing wilds, I have four of a kind, so I'm going to bet a bunch of money. All right, so I want you to know that before the next round happens. Well, now everyone's going to fold. You just set yourself up for failure, so don't be an idiot. Okay, but that's also, it's not lying to not divulge what all your plans are. That's not deception in the same way. Now, it is wrong to make a promise and to break it. Okay, that really is a kind of bearing false witness. I've pledged myself to, I've made an oath. We don't really think of oaths too much today in the 21st century. But in a medieval mindset, and also like taking vows, like so priests would take vows. The Protestants were even big into this too. There's a whole section in the Calvinist Westminster Confession of Faith on oaths and vows. Seems kind of peculiar. It's a big deal. If you're going to make an oath, you keep it. And like I said, we don't really think of oaths and vows in the same way in the 21st century, really. But we still have laws against perjury. If you show up in court and you swear on whatever it is you swear on, if you say something and later that's contradicted, even if it's immaterial, like even if it wasn't something criminal, you can perjure yourself by saying something that's not true, even if it's really of not much consequence. It's still perjury. And that can carry with it hefty penalties. So making an oath, pledging something, all right, and then going back against it, that's wrong. But divulging everything, what all your plans are, that's not an issue. Like, don't give away your intelligence. Now, this doesn't. Now, keep in mind, we didn't have in the Middle Ages the same kind of espionage, okay, spy networks and so forth that exist today. The same kind of intelligence and intelligence agencies, okay. But I mean, there was espionage, but not to the same degree. In fact, it was considered rather duplicitous, even to this day, to some degree. Like, we acknowledge that it exists, but it's not really endorsed happily. But in terms of justice in this way, I like how Thomas ends this by saying, "What I've already said here, this suffices for replies to the objections. I don't need to go into specific objections. This is good enough." It's bold and it's confident. So let's review this when it comes to warfare. So in summary, when we're talking about war, okay, just war, we can talk about it in really two ways when we're talking about just war, and this is how it actually gets divided up. Is we can talk about jus ad bellum, okay, which means literally justice or justness going up into war, and then we can talk about jus in bello, which is a Latin expression that means being just in the war. Okay, well, why? Okay, if bellum means, why the different endings? Latin's weird. It has different case endings. You might have studied a language that has different case endings, but so we got jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Okay, both of them mean like just war. That's usually how it gets tweaked. And so the jus ad bellum, all right, the being just going to war, that includes really the first two aspects. Okay, do you have a legitimate authority? Okay, if not, no, it's not. It's not just automatically. Okay, automatic. If you're not a respectable authority. Now, how do we constitute that? Well, in a medieval mindset, obviously the state, whatever state power is an authority, that's the just authority, whether it be really Christian or not. Even Paul, which in Romans 13, all right, St. Paul, the Apostle Paul, Thomas occasionally appeals to the epistles of Paul, namely the one of Romans, where in chapter 13 it says really all authorities, whether they're Christian authorities or not, are all ordained by God. Now, in the Middle Ages, if you're in Western Europe, all authorities are at least in name Christian, but even the Roman authority would have been considered a legitimate authority to Paul and to Christians. All right, so even non-Christian authority is authoritative because the authoritative structures themselves have been dictated and distributed by God. All right, that's part of at least this classical and medieval Christian mindset. Now, of course, it's better if it's a Christian, a distinctively Christian authority, but it's not as though the non-Christian authorities, they still derive their authority from God. So even the most pagan kingdom in the world, its king only has authority because that authority still comes from the Christian God. Period. In a Christian mindset. Now, there are ways that those non-Christian authorities can still do things unjustly, for sure. But there are ways in which even the Christian authorities might do something unjustly. So it's the authority is only authoritative insofar as it comes from God. No authority is authoritative if it doesn't come from God, period. This is why, also in a Christian, the same kind of Christian view, the institution of the family. The father is authoritative. Whether he be a Christian or not, the father is in charge. I'm not endorsing that position. I'm saying that's the classical and medieval position, a sort of patriarchal position. The father is in charge. The husband is the authoritative figure in the familial relationship. That's taken as a given. But even if that husband is not a Christian, he's still authoritative because that is the authoritative structure that has been dictated and created by God and permeates out into the world. Okay, so those structures are there. Okay, they just exist in the world. But that authority, period, comes from God. If that authority hasn't been given, so I've mentioned primarily 3 institutions that are recognized as being authoritated, if you'll permit me that, by God. The state, on whatever magnitude level. Things get confusing even in the Middle Ages. Do I follow the emperor? Do I follow the king? Do I follow the baron? Who do I follow? Now, if you're living in the Holy Roman Empire, that's a very confusing question. But and that happens in other places too. Who is my authority? That's part of the frustration of Western Europe, is figuring out who's actually in charge. Okay, the 100 Years' War between England and France. The King of England is himself the Duke of Anjou, so he's subject to the King of France, but he's also the King of England. So is the King of England the King of England, or is he actually under the King of France? And that's why they go to war all the time. And then when the King of France dies, the King of England will say, I should actually be the King of France too. Okay, that leads into all kinds of conflicts at the back end of the 100 Years' War, Henry V, and into all kinds of problems in England too, in the Wars of the Roses. I just say those as examples. So it's not an easy question figuring out like what exactly the legitimate authority is, but nevertheless, the first criteria is war can only be issued by and declared by a legitimate authority. It seems to be difficult to define actually what the legitimate authority is. It seems easier to figure out what it's not. So it's not you. Okay. No individual is themselves an authority in themselves. No, you might think, well, what about the king? The king is an individual. Really, the sovereign of a nation wasn't thought of as an individual. This notion of an individual is a very modern, contemporary notion. Even the individual sovereign, like a king or a queen, was thought of as part of the apparatus of the state itself. Even if they had particular proclivities, their if you will, their office or their title is considered part of the state. Whatever the state is, whether it be a nation, kingdom, dukedom, empire, whatever it is, they are considered part of it. So if they're part of that kind of authority, that's legitimate. But your little club down the road, not a legitimate authority. So this comes up like in talking about, say something like the American War for Independence. Can these Continental Congress representatives, do they have? Yes, they've declared. So consider the American Declaration of Independence. Since the American War for Independence was successful by 1783, everything looks pretty solid retrospectively. But if you're going into it at the time, it looks rather seditious. Because here you have all these people, the Continental Congress meeting together saying, you know what? We're going to war against the king. when really it was Parliament who passed those intolerable acts and so forth. But there's a lot of name calling of George III, King of England, in the Declaration of Independence, saying we're not gonna obey him. He's done this, that, and the other. We're done. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary, all right, it's really almost a, instead of being a divorce between spouses, it's really a divorce between peoples. That's that language. We're breaking up with you. Well, do you have the authority to do that? Well, eventually it's given really by England. All right, we give up. You can have it. It's a settlement. Was the legitimate authority? No. Now, at least early on, it wasn't perceived to be. I'm not saying that it wasn't. I'm saying it wasn't perceived to be. It was considered seditious to go to war against Britain, 1776, and really the first shots were fired in 1775. It's over 1783, sort of, because the United States goes to war with England again, 1812 to 1815, in the strangely titled War of 1812, which, again, if you're fighting the War of 1812 and 1815, that seems like a strange title for a war. Wherein there seems to be some payback there. War of 1812, the White House gets burned down, the initial one. There's another one today. That's not the original White House. That's the reboot. So legitimate authority. And sometimes it seems obvious what's legitimate and what's not. But give it some thought, especially when we think about modern conflicts. Right? Second aspect, just causes. What's a good reason for going to war? I don't like them. They've got stuff I want. I've been treated unjustly in some way. Or we have, our people. Yeah. Now think about that. That sounds actually kind of revolutionary. And I think it is. I do think there's actually, I want to be careful saying this here, I do think there's a little bit of almost a seed of, I don't want to say Protestantism, because that would be, I think, too strong here. But there's a seed of recompense here that says, if I've been treated wrongly, that needs to be redressed. And Thomas says that thoroughly again and again in talking about war here. Okay, if there might be something, if I've been wronged, I'm entitled to that wrong being righted by an authority. Now there's a sort of a, you know, a blank on, well, what if the authority is not doing what it should be doing? It's implied that it is. But if it's not, well, I think I'll say this here. I know I've mentioned, Thomas says some other things elsewhere. I think if you want to, I think what tempers some of that conversation there is actually what Thomas has to say about justice and injustice, also in part 2 of part 2, questions 58 and 59. I really think what he says there should temper that part of the conversation. I actually think he says a lot here that is potentially revolutionary in the 13th century. It's there. I think that some of the Protestants got this. I think there's some elements of our modern contemporary notions of democracy and liberty that are here in Thomas. They're in a very rudimentary form, but they're there. All right, like I said, in like a germ form, they're there. Am I saying Thomas is revolutionary? No. Okay, is it there? Is there kind of a latent sense in which it's hiding in there? Yeah. In the 13th century. But then the third aspect is, I think, the aspect that has been most neglected in our conversations about warfare in the West. Or we'll talk about it, but it comes up usually later, after the fact. And that's that, remember, I talked, everything that so far has been jus ad bellum. This is jus in bello. Okay, how are you just in war? You have the right intentions. Now, it's not just, oh, I think good thoughts. It's not just some positive thinking nonsense. It is, now that we, the right people, have gone to war for the right reasons, we now need to conduct it in the right way. You might have had the most just, righteous reasons for going to war. But how will you keep it? How will you maintain it? Will you preserve your dignity and your rightness and maybe your righteousness in the conflict itself? Or will you deign for that, or will you go into undignified levels of catastrophe and horror to win? Will you be ruthless, or will you be right? Now, I know we're talking about war here, but all kind. I can't tell you how many times someone will take like the Chinese text Sun Tzu, okay, the art of war, and then turn it into business principles. Like, I know we're talking about this in war, like actual warfare with combatants. But the 21st century looks a little bit different, but still, this stuff pops up, and it pops up even in interpersonal stuff. Okay, do you have the right reason for what you're doing? But then also looking at it as, are you doing this the right way? Are you conducting yourself in the right way now? That's harder. You can go again. The whole. I mean, you've heard the expression, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I don't want to conflate the notion of intentions here. You can go to war for the right reasons with legitimate authority, and then be in this situation where now, is it okay if we torture these people? Oh, it's not really torture. We can go. It's yeah, it's bad, but it's not torture. It's not great. I wouldn't want it to happen to me, but it's not torture. Is that right? And even if it's depending on the level of torture right, period. It's a whole domain of practical ethics talks about that. Yeah, it's right if it gets the right results. Or you can talk about utilitarian calculus. The destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was entirely appropriate if it prevented millions of casualties that would have transpired had the Pacific Theater gone on. Granted, stop right there, time out. We have no way of knowing that, because that's a universe that doesn't exist. We can talk about hypotheticals. You can talk about data. Japan was already trying to surrender at that point, and nevertheless the United States persisted in nuking two of its cities. Civilians and all. The purpose there was to punish. It was to be retributive. It was to be payback. My purpose there is not to indict the United States. You can take it as such. That's not the point. You can think of many instances throughout history. I mean, look at the American Civil War. Okay. All right. We can look at the American Civil War in detail. The southern states, especially South Carolina and Georgia, they have articles of secession. They're like little tiny declarations of independence where they say explicitly, no, we're seceding because we like slavery and we want to keep it. You can look it up yourself. Very clear, uncontrovertible. Becomes a matter of, well, is that really what happened? Yes. Okay, now does that justify the United States invading the South as a legitimate authority? It looks like there's a redressing of wrongs. South Carolina, can they really secede? And the others, can they do that? There's a conflict of, is there a legitimate authority? Is there a redressing of wrongs? It doesn't seem like General Beauregard can just take Fort Sumter, which is United States property. American Civil War. But then intention, all right, got good reasons to preserve the Union, and later, not initially, to free the slaves. That became a cause later on. It was not the initial cause of Union cohesion and preservation. It wasn't there at the beginning. Okay. Was it there? Yes. Was it some of the initial causes going into? Yeah, it was there in the atmosphere, but it wasn't the cause of. It wasn't the original cause of the Union going to the South, invading the South. Now, did that justify what, say, General Grant did at Vicksburg? What General Sherman did in his marches through the South? If you ask a Southerner, probably not. And if you ask a Northerner, probably, well, they had it coming. The point is that's a difficult question to answer in terms of like how you mete out what you're doing in war, what's appropriate and what's not. The question that Thomas asks is it for the purposes of at the end of the day making real peace and preserving goodness? Or is it for payback, retribution, power, lust for power, okay, and evil at the end of the day? So you look at any war throughout history and look at the behavior of the combatants. Again, best reasons going in. But what did the people do? Part of me wonders, has there ever been a war that has met all these criteria, all three? I gotta tell you, I can't think of one. And even though Thomas wrote this 800 years ago, I have to wonder, could we aspire to better? If we're going to have conflict, and we're going to have conflict that ends in violence at some point, which human beings have been doing from day one to now, it's happening now, could we do better? And I think the lesson that I learned from Thomas and Mozart is that if we just think a little bit more clearly, maybe we can get a little better at this. Something to consider. That's all.